Secretary Kobach's communications director, and I'm really standing here to introduce the star of the show, who will then introduce her dad. This is Molly. She's 11 as of a week ago, so she's in the early 11s. And she wants to be an ornithologist or an endocrinologist when she grows up. They live in Lecompton. She has 4 sisters. She's the middle child, the very middle child. And, if you have watched any of Kris's Facebook Lives, Molly is his assistant and my assistant in this effort, and she's really good at it. Now she's going to introduce her dad, Molly Kobach.
Okay.
Here.
Let me move this.
That's good.
There you go.
Wow, yeah.
I don't have a chair.
Okay, today I am speaking honestly because I wanted to for my dad. And so my sister spoke at a forum a couple weeks ago, and she said in the forum that this was really out of her comfort zone, but weird as it is, this is not out of my comfort zone. and I got that from my dad. And so I got a couple things from my dad. I got diabetes, which, it's not the greatest thing, but I also got my courage, my braveness to speak out against what I think is right. But that does come in knowing when my mom is homeschooling me. And I also, so through that, God gave me honesty, which I can't keep secrets for more than like a day or two. So if you're going to tell me your birthday present, then don't tell me the day before. And here's something you may not know about my dad. So he's one of the most fun people I know. And he will never say no to sledding. And that's something is a family memory for years. Like ever since 5-6 years ago, ever since we bought our farm, we've been sledding a ton. And so I remember when I was younger, I'd be closing my eyes, about to go downhill. Dad's a very good person to sled with. We go pretty fast. And I'd be sitting in the front of the sled while Dad's holding on to me before he goes this drop off. And it's just kind of a fun memory that I remember. And I'm closing my eyes to keep the snow out of my eyes. And that's just something I love to do with my dad. And also coming to events with him. He'll never say no to that. Or like if I want to come, someone in my family, one of my sisters wants to go to an event, he'll make sure we can go. And I love that. He likes the company, and so it's great. And there's something else. Where is it? Oh, yeah, half birthdays. So every year on my half birthday, on one of my sister's half birthdays, we have a whole day with our dad. We do, in the beginning, if Dad has some events or something needs to get done that day, we'll go with him. And then that day we'll get to pick out where we want to eat, and we'll go shopping at a certain store. And that's just something else that really I love to do with my dad, and it's really fun. And that's why this is just a few stuff you may not know about my dad. He's running for Senate, obviously. And thank you. Here is Kris Kobach.
This is a new thing. We haven't been having her introduce me. Oh, I got to get the mic here. But we got home after midnight last night from Greensburg. And so we had it was a long drive. It was like over 4 hours. And then my wife told me this morning, yeah, Molly wants to speak for you. And I was like, okay. And she's pretty good at that. I think I may have to send her out on the campaign trail. That'd be pretty good. That'd free me up a little bit. I might actually get a little more sleep. So what I thought I'd do, I'm going to do 2 things. One is give you a campaign update, talk about the politics for about 15 minutes. And then secondly, talk about something that I think you'll enjoy, and that is the U.S. Constitution. Because I was a professor of constitutional law for 15 years in UMKC. I lived on the Kansas side of the metro area. That's where I started my career. I grew up west of Topeka. Now we live on a farm just west of Lecompton. And go ahead and please keep eating, by the way. And if you want seconds, just keep going. Don't feel rude if you want to get up and go get some food or whatever you want to do. So anyway, I taught at UMKC for 15 years as a constitutional law professor, and several people in 2009, remember the Tea Party period between 2009 and 2010? They said, "Hey, Kris, why don't you do can you summarize all of constitutional law in a little speech?" And I said, "Well, that's 2 semesters in law school. I don't know if I can crunch it down to a little speech." I said, "Maybe 3 hours." And then I thought, wait a minute, nobody wants to listen to anybody for 3 hours. I don't care what it is. And so I tried to condense it down to 1 hour. So I'm going to give you a 1-hour Constitution 101 crash course that I think you might find interesting, and then we'll take questions. But before I do that, let me summarize where the race is for the U.S. Senate today. As you probably know, this country is in chaos right now. We've got rioters pulling down statues in Washington, D.C. We've got rioters trying to taking control over parts of Portland, rioting in New York City. It's just chaos. And in my opinion, this is not the time when we need to send, somebody who's going to go try to be everybody's friend to Washington. This is when we need to send a fighter to stand up for our Constitution, for ICE, for police, for our flag. And by the way, if they're kneeling when the NFL starts, I'm not watching a single game. I don't care if the Chiefs just won. And this is a time we need to stand firm for all of the things that we hold dear and that are under attack right now. And that's why I feel really called that maybe this is what I was supposed to do. And certainly a lot of people around Kansas have encouraged me to run. And of course, it's only 6 days away. For those of you who haven't been keeping track, the voting day is on Tuesday. You can go to the county courthouse or the county clerk's office, and you can vote early if you want. But either vote early or vote on Tuesday. But it's right around the corner. So this race right now is, even though there are 11 people on the ballot, the race is shaping up to be a 2-person race between me and Roger Marshall. All the polls show that, and it's very tight. In fact, the latest polling we've seen shows I'm ahead by about 3%, but 3% is within the margin of error, right? That's so close. So please do remember to vote. Hopefully you'll vote for me, but please remember, tell your family to remember to vote. Tell your cousin that you don't normally call, tell him or her to remember to vote. Tell your friends, your neighbors, whatever, because this could be one of those elections that comes down to 100 votes. And the number of people in this room could actually be the margin of victory in an election. So please do that. And so let me tell you a little bit about, although Roger Marshall and I are very close in terms of our percentage of support in the state, we are not very close on the issues. And that's something else that's interesting about this race is normally in a Republican primary, the candidates are pretty close, right? You're trying to find a little bit of daylight between them. You don't see much daylight. For whatever reason, we are really very different on a lot of issues, and I wanted to just give you a few issues so you know, as informed voters, just what the differences are. And a lot of them have to do with my background. As you know, probably, I've been advising President Trump since February of 2016 on illegal immigration and on border security generally. and I have continued to maintain contact with the president. Was just on the phone with him about 4.5 weeks ago after the Supreme Court issued the DACA decision. And I'm very conservative on that issue. For the last 1.5 years, I've been general counsel for We Build the Wall, which, by the way, is a private organization that raises private money, and last summer completed the first ever privately funded section of border wall in U.S. history. How cool is that? And then we completed a second section in December, and we would have this spring been started on our third section, but the COVID shutdown kind of put us in a holding pattern. But we hope to get that third section done before the end of the year. So it's pretty neat to be part of that. Well, my position on illegal immigration is very clear. My opponent's position is the opposite. In 2017, he gave a speech making fun of Trump's wall, said building a wall is not feasible. I think that's flat out false. In 2018, he voted for amnesty. I've always opposed amnesty. And then just this year in 2020, he and 37 other House moderates in the U.S. House of Representatives signed a letter on May 26th. And in the letter, they said, please, Mr. President, do not reduce the number of incoming H-2B workers. Those are unskilled, non-agriculture workers, people who work from foreign countries who work in hotels, kitchens, landscaping, construction, meatpacking. And he said, don't reduce those numbers. I immediately wrote an article in Breitbart, where I have a column at Breitbart.com, and I said, no, that's the wrong approach. This is exactly when you close the doors. When 40 million Americans are unemployed, this is when you shut the doors temporarily, we get our own people back to work, and then you can open up the doors again to legal work visas. Anyway, President Trump a few weeks ago agreed with my position, thank goodness. But it just shows you how the two candidates are, exact opposites. Another issue where we're exact opposites is on spending. So you know my position. You may not know this. I think it's on our literature. But when I was your Secretary of State, I reduced spending in my agency from 7.0 million down to 4.6 million a year, and cut it every single year. And I'm pretty sure I was the head of the only agency in Kansas government that actually cut spending those 8 years in a row. And I did it because the baby boomers are retiring. That's how I was able to cut it so much. Every time someone retired, I told my deputies, let's not hire somebody if we don't have to. And just that way we don't have to fire anyone, but we can shrink the government without firing anybody. And we did it. And I want to take the same approach to Washington. My opponent, he had an opportunity in 2018 to vote on a bill that would just take a 1% haircut. It's you may have heard of this plan. Rand Paul has been promoting this. A 1% cut from every agency except the Defense Department. And he voted against that. I would have voted in favor of it, and I would have said 1% is not enough. Let's try 5% or 10% haircut off these agencies. And so there's another issue where we're completely different. And so I've been pressing him on these issues. And we had 3 debates, 3 official Republican Party debates. And after the third one, his campaign made a request to the state party saying, well, we don't want any more debates where the candidates talk to each other and press each other. We want the third one to be a forum where there's just conversations and the candidates cannot interact. And the rest of us candidates said, no, we signed on for 4 debates. And Marshall said, nope, we're not going to do that. And so the 4th debate was canceled. Since then, there have been a half a dozen forums where the candidates do get to stand side by side. In fact, the most recent one was last night in Greensburg. And every time there's a forum where the candidates stand side by side and have to answer questions, he doesn't show up. And there's been a half a dozen. Greensburg, Winfield, I could just go down the list. Coffeyville. Anyway, we were just counting them the other day. But the point is, if he does, yes, we disagree, but you got to be willing to explain your position. You can't explain it in a friendly scrimmage with other Republicans. What are you going to do when the Democrat gets in your face or when Chuck Schumer gets in your face? You need to be able to explain your position. So anyway, I mentioned those 2 differences, immigration and spending, but I want to talk about a third one that is, I did not think it would become such an important issue, but has become very important. And those of you who are in the cattle industry or in the beef industry in any respect, you might know about this. How many of you are aware of the crisis that's going on in the beef industry? Okay, yeah, a lot of you are. Okay, so for those of you who aren't aware, here's the quick summary. In the last 20 years, 6,000 Kansas cattle ranches have gone out of business. A lot of those are, 5th generation, 4th generation family ranches that had to sell out. Yet at the same time, what's the price of steaks in the supermarket? A couple months ago, it was the highest we've ever seen in our lifetimes. So how is it that a product that is priced as high as we've ever seen, the people who make the product are losing their livelihoods? And the answer is, of course, the middleman. The beef packing industry has consolidated. So 30 years ago, lots of small, medium-sized packers, not anymore. Now 4 big packers control 82% of all beef processed in America. The cattle rancher doesn't have a lot of places to sell the cattle anymore. And there's a U.S. Department of Justice investigation going on into what appears to be collusive pricing. So they're paying the packers or the feedlots that make the purchase for the packers are paying $1.10 per pound, and they're selling to the grocer at $4.75 per pound. Or to frame it in different terms, the average cattleman now is losing $200 a head, and the packer is gaining about $1,500 per head. So there's an investigation going into the collusive pricing practices, but that investigation could take years because the Justice Department has to reach their conclusions, then it might go to court, and it might be a year and a half, 2 years before that results in any relief for Kansas cattlemen. But there are 3 legislative solutions. I'm in favor of all 3. Roger Marshall is opposed to all 3. And I want to just go through them real quickly. One is the Prime Act, and that's sponsored by Representative Massey out of Kentucky. It's got 52 co-sponsors, most of them Republicans from the Midwest, but not Roger Marshall. And that would bring small and medium-sized packers back onto the market by deregulating. They would no longer have to follow the restrictive and expensive federal regulations. They'd only need to follow state regulations and could sell their product anywhere within the state of Kansas or whatever state. Second is the 5014 Act. And this is Senator Chuck Grassley in the U.S. Senate. He's from Iowa. He's trying to save the cattle industry. And this would require the big packers to buy at least 50% of their cattle on the open or spot market, which is a cash market, and then take possession within 14 days. It's much more transparent than the way they're manipulating prices right now. And the third thing, and again, Marshall is opposed to that. I'm for it. The third thing is mandatory country of origin labeling. I'm for it. Marshall's against it. And this is just basic common sense. We had country of origin labeling from 2013 to about 2015, and then the World Trade Organization said, well, gosh, if you tell people where the beef is from, Americans are more likely to buy American beef. Duh. And some squishy congressmen and senators in the Congress said, well, gosh, the World Trade Organization kind of ruled against us. Instead of appealing it, let's just stop doing mandatory country of origin labeling. And right after they stopped, the price of beef took another hit. Or the price to the cattlemen took another hit. Look, that's another thing we can do that will give the Kansas cattlemen, the American cattlemen, another boost in the price, because Americans want American beef. And one thing that's happening now is that USDA-approved stamp is on every beef that comes out of any packing plant in America. And the problem is, it's not all from the United States. Two of the big 4 packers are from Brazil, and they are substituting Brazilian cattle for American cattle. It's an inferior product, but the person in Johnson County who goes to the grocery store, or the person here in Nemaha County who goes to the grocery store, does not know. You do not know where that animal came from. And so it's hurting the American ranchers, and it's hurting the consumer. Look, as a consumer, we want to know if there's some outbreak of some animal-related disease in Brazil or Canada or Mexico, we should be able to make a decision that, you know what, I'm not going to buy my beef from that country for a while. And we are not getting information. So this is another big one. And you might say, well, why in the world's Marshall not in favor of helping out the cattlemen? I have asked him this. There was a debate in Manhattan. I presented the question to him, gave him 40. When you do that in these debates, the other guy gets 45 seconds to respond, and he didn't respond. He said, more fake news. And then I can't remember what else he said. More fake news, and I always stand with Kansas ranches. But he won't explain why he won't support those bills. And you can look, if you want, at opensecrets.org, which is a nonpartisan organization that just looks at campaign contributions. Go there, look at my contributions. You won't find any big meatpacking industry contributions, but he's got over 200 grand in the last 3 cycles from the big packers and their allies. So that pretty much explains why he's so silent on this. So one of the things that's going to be my highest priority is getting that done immediately, because if we wait another 6 months and we haven't done anything, that's going to be another 100, 200, I don't know how many Kansas ranches will go out of business in that time. And here's one more thing. What happens when a Kansas cattle ranch goes out of business? Do they immediately have to try to find some way to recoup, to pay off their debts, to pay for the next meal, to pay their mortgage, whatever. Where do they sell to? And the one thing they have to sell, what asset is land, right? And so are they going to be able to sell that land to the neighboring ranch next door? No, because the neighboring ranch next door is underwater too. And so they almost always end up selling to large companies, and a lot of them are foreign owned. And a lot of them are from Brazil and China. So not only are we losing part of our soul every time another Kansas cattle ranch goes out of business, we're literally losing our land. Kansans are no longer owning Kansas. And so it's a big issue, and it's become a big point of contrast between me and Marshall. There's one other issue which I don't know his position on, but this is also a surprise issue for me. Not a surprise for me, but I didn't expect this to be part of a Senate campaign. But there's an urgency to it. It may not be the most important issue on your list, but it's one of the most critical to address soon. And that's the issue of trans athletes in female sports. Have you heard about this? It is insane. In the last 2 years, records have been shattered by biological males competing in women's sports, in women's track and field, women's bicycling, and women's weightlifting. And if we don't do anything about this, more records will be shattered in 3 more sports in the next year, and then another 3 sports. And it'll go on and on and on until eventually America will wake up and say, what happened? Why are all the records in women's sports held by biological males now? And I think we should all be concerned about this. And I'm particularly concerned because I'm the father of 5 daughters. And I don't know if any of them are going to compete at a collegiate level, like I competed at a collegiate level, and I know the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. I'm sure many of you did or know people who did. But, if someone gets serious about a sport, they devote a part of their lives to it, right? I mean, it becomes something they think about every day. If one of my daughters makes it onto the college team or something and then gets to the championship, and then the title is snatched away by a biological male, how outrageous is that? I mean, it's just, and not only is it outrageous, it's just not fair. That's the whole reason we contributed and completed the creation of a competitive environment for women's sports in the 1970s, right? It was that we wanted women to have the same opportunity men had to get a scholarship, experience the character building, experience all of the enjoyment of competitive sports at a high level, and we created a vibrant arena of women's sports. And of course, the reason we separate women's sports from men's sports is because men have physical advantages. That's just how God created us. Men are bigger and upper body strength and all that. The same reason is we don't have 12-year-olds competing against 22-year-olds. We have age divisions. We have weight divisions in a lot of sports because you don't have the heavyweight competing against the flyweight. And so it's all about fairness. And so it's just, not only is it ridiculous, it's unfair. Anyway, the reason I'm talking about it is there's an easy solution in the Senate, and that is, and I'm going to propose this as soon as I get there, any college that allows biological males to compete on the women's team or in the women's competition loses all Title IX money. Done. That'll solve the problem. And I know Randy's here. I'd encourage our state legislature to solve it. It's happening at the high school level, too. The legislature could pass a similar law. I think Idaho may have already done it. One other state's already done it, to restrict competition in high school sports so that the women's sports cannot have biological males competing in it. Someone had a question? Someone raised a hand here. Yeah.
Let's clean up the restrooms first.
Yes. Well, there's that, too.
I have daughters.
I know who would be able to stand in front of a Democrat audience and say what I just said. They are forbidden from saying certain things. They have a cancel culture. And so as a result, all of the feminists are silent. The same feminists who fought for the creation of women's sports. The only feminist I know who has spoken out vocally against this is Martina Navratilova, the tennis champion. And good for her. But most do not have the whatever it is, the ability to speak out in that oppressive left-wing environment. And so it's down to us Republicans and the Republicans that have enough backbone to say things that our politically correct culture says, oh, don't talk about that, don't talk about that. And there's a dreadfully low number of Republicans who are willing to talk about it. Well, if you guys know anything about me, I'm not afraid to flap my jaws and talk about something. So it's got to be talked about. So that's one of the things I hope to do when I get there. So that's a quick summary. of the race where it is right now. Oh, one more thing. So because the race is close and because I am slightly ahead in the polls, you are seeing the nastiest false ads I have ever seen in my political career. And did you know that a lot of them are coming from Mitch McConnell and his allies in Washington, D.C.? This has happened again and again and again. For example, 6 years ago in 2014, now this was not an open seat, this was an incumbent. In Mississippi, a guy named Kris McDaniel, who was a conservative, was running against Thad Cochran, who was U.S. Senator, who was very moderate. And the conservative was winning. Same thing. Mitch McConnell came in, dumped millions of dollars, trashing McDaniel, saying false things on Mississippi television, and they ended up knocking McDaniel out. So they're trying to do the same thing here. And there are the other examples of this too. But whenever a conservative is ahead, unfortunately, the establishment that is around McConnell in D.C. will come in and just try to clobber the conservative. They don't want outspoken conservatives like Ted Cruz. They had enough of Ted Cruz when he got there. They don't want more people like him. And so they just try to crush us in the primaries, which is a shame because we conservatives are the ones who are going to save this party, if anyone is. And we are the ones who are going to have President Trump's back if, God willing, he wins re-election. So you need to know that. The ads are false. There's one ad that says I'm a white nationalist. I mean, it's just crazy. The kernel that they cite in that ad is they cite an article, or they cite the fact that I have accepted thousands of dollars from the Immigration Reform PAC. But the Immigration Reform PAC is just a political action committee, is just a pro-border enforcement, pro-ICE, pro-wall PAC that's given money to over 100 members of Congress. But because the Southern Poverty Law Center said in an article that they think they're white nationalists, the ad says, oh, then they're white nationalists. So it's completely false. They've also got a false ad running saying I'm not pro-life. Also completely false. They've got another ad that isn't running as much saying that I've lined my pockets with public money. And then the little citation is an editorial written by Steve Rose for the Kansas City Star. And in the editorial, Steve Rose complained back in 2013, I think it was, that while I was your Secretary of State, on weekends and on evenings, I did some legal work to stop illegal immigration. I represented some clients in my spare time in the evenings. And but that's not lining your pockets with public money. That's doing what a lot of people in Kansas do.
Is that called a job?
It's called a job, yeah. But anyway, so you can see these ads are completely false. And they take something that looks sort of similar to the lie, and they cite that in the asterisk at the bottom, but it doesn't support the lie that they're saying. Yeah.
So how can politicians get away with that? Every time on
Yes.
Lies work.
Well, here, I'll tell you what the reason is. So it's slander and it's libel, and if someone did that to you, you could sue them, and you would have a very good chance of winning. If someone does that to a public figure, which includes candidates for office, then the standard for libel is much higher to prove. You have to show that the person writing the ad knew every single statement was false and intended to make a false statement, which you would think you could probably show that. But in court, that's a really much higher standard to do. So really, there are several ways to solve this problem. One would be to change the standards for libel so you could just sue them. Another would be to have the Federal Communications Commission allow them to have a process for forcing someone to prove that their ad is truthful. But yeah, and that's one thing I'd like to look at in Congress too, because in the Senate. But anyway, I just want you to be aware that those are false ads, and it's part of an effort to. And there's over $4 million worth, over $4 million of ads, more than twice the amount of money we've spent. And my campaign has raised about $1 million total, and we're putting every penny on the air right now. And by the way, if you feel like making a contribution, I wasn't coming here to ask for contributions, but if you do we have envelopes? We did bring some. Okay, Denidri has some envelopes. Feel free, because we're making our final advertising buy on Friday, and literally every penny that we raise goes into more radio and TV ads to try to answer back. Yeah.
Who's the Sunflower Group?
Yeah, the Sunflower PAC or Sunflower State PAC. That's an interesting one. So they are affiliated, we think, with Democrats. However, what they are doing is they are attacking me. I think what they're trying to do is they are trying to, the Democrats right now have $3.5 million. The Bollier campaign has $3.5 million in the bank. And some people have said, well, the attacks on Marshall look worse than the attacks on you, Kris. They might be trying to help you. I think what they're trying to do is they've got $3.5 million to spend, and they're trying to define the Republican candidates. Now, we already know what they're going to say about me. The Democrats are going to say, I'm too conservative for Kansas. And so that's what their ad says. Kobach is too conservative. Nobody knows Marshall outside of his district. And so I think what they're trying to do is brand Marshall before people hear his definition, should he win, his definition of who he is. So they're saying he's fake and he waffles back and forth. So that's what they're saying. So I think what they're doing is just spending their money early against both of the leading candidates and then, trying to get a, what are you going to say?
It says you won't compromise on immigration or building a wall. That's good.
Yeah.
It says you think about getting tougher on China. That's good. It says you have the toughest laws on voting in any state. That's good. And won't budge on new gun laws. That's good.
Yeah. Of course, to Democrats, that's all bad. So it's anyway. So there's that group. There's Mitch McConnell's group spending money. I've never seen a race with so much out-of-state money coming into Kansas. So we just got to make sure we pick our own senator, and the way we do that is ignore all the ads and just go vote for the person you want to vote for.
Boy, they're putting on a huge amount on websites.
Yes.
I mean, it's just boom, boom,
Oh, I
boom,
know,
boom,
I know.
boom. And I thought, something's not, it didn't look right at the first. I thought, well, this has got to be a Democrat. And I've seen her ads on TV.
Yes.
They never say Democrat. Never.
Right.
For some reason, that's just a bad thing. I don't know why.
So I'll give you guys a preview of what I'm going to be saying after the primary, if I win this, God willing, and that is Bollier's record in the Senate and in the House. She was in the House before she was in the Senate. Is one of the most liberal, radical records Kansas has ever seen. She votes for every gun control restriction, against anything that will enhance our gun rights. She is very radical on the trans issue. She's all about transsexual rights. On abortion, she is worse than pro-abortion. She has made statements on the floor of the Kansas legislature saying that some lives are not worth living, referring apparently to Down syndrome children. She's way out there. And of course, her ads don't say she's a Democrat. The ads make her say, I'm a reasonable person of the center.
But she's a doctor.
Yes, and a doctor. Yeah, there you go.
What's that got to do with anything?
That's a good question. So anyway, and I'm sure Randy could give us, it's interesting how many legislators have come up to me and said, I've got to tell you some of the things she has said in the legislature. And I'm just learning them. I mean, I've known about many of them, but I keep learning more and more. So it's going to be a very, in the general, it's going to be hopefully a fight between a very staunch conservative and a very radical liberal. And that gives Kansans a very clear choice. And every time Kansans have a clear choice like that, they always vote for the conservative in a federal race. Okay, I am going to jump to the Constitution. All right, perfect. We've got. I'll do this in less than an hour, but I want you to hear this because I think you'll enjoy it. So I'm going to talk about 4 topics. First, topic number 1 is general principles of the Constitution. Topic number 2 is the Commerce Power. Topic number 3 is the First Amendment Establishment Clause, and number 4 is the Second Amendment. And I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on each. And hopefully you will learn something. I'm sure you will learn something, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Okay, so general principles of the Constitution. America was the first blank. What were we? The first what? You might have heard something in school, in college, on TV. We were the first what? Okay, that's very close. Yeah, I'm glad you didn't say democracy. So some people say democracy. We're not a democracy. A true democracy is a system where people vote directly on the laws. We aren't one, but if we were, we wouldn't be the first. Ancient Athens had a democratic form of government. The Swiss cantons, some of them have had a pure democracy since the 1500s. So we're not that. Republic. Are we the first republic? Almost. The British Parliament was a republican form of government before we were a republic. But we are the first something. We are the first constitutional republic. We're the first nation in the world that said the sovereign is not all powerful. The sovereign is restricted by certain written restrictions in the Constitution. And so to think about it this way, in England, either the Parliament or the Crown, in early English history it would be the Crown, in later English history it would be Parliament. Parliament could pass a law saying all blue-eyed people shall be imprisoned. Seriously, Parliament has the ability to pass that law. There is no written constitution in England that says Parliament can't do that. And in most countries, the government is fully sovereign in that respect, meaning they can do whatever they want to do. But America came up with the idea that government can be limited to a written list of powers and can also be confined by a Bill of Rights so that government cannot do certain things. And so that was a uniquely American, and that the Constitution would be enforceable too, that the courts or the other branches could enforce the Constitution. So that's what we were the first of the world in. And get this, today, if a new country forms, some former Soviet country or some country breaks off another country in East Europe and becomes independent, what's the first thing they do? They write a constitution that looks just like the American Constitution, and then they sort of present it to the world and they say, see, we're a real country. And so now our system of government has become the defining feature of what a true government looks like, a truly independent, legitimate government. Now, that doesn't mean that those countries have constitutionalism and have a culture of constitutionalism that supports putting government into a confined area, but that's how we define a successful system. Okay, second principle, enumerated powers. The federal government is a government of enumerated powers, which means listed powers. This goes along with the whole idea of a constitutional republic, and that is the government only has the powers that are written down. This is distinct from the state governments, which are governments of unenumerated or residual powers. The state government has what are called police powers. It has nothing to do with red lights and sirens. Police powers are the general power to protect the health, safety, welfare, and morality of the people. So when the legislators go to Topeka, they don't have to look at a list of what can we do, what can't we do, although the Constitution may have some limits on what they can and can't do. They can do generally anything that's good for the people of Kansas. But in Congress, they cannot do that. In Congress, they have to find it on a list. And that list is found right here in the U.S. Constitution. And most of what the powers of the federal government have, most of the powers are found in Article 1, Section 8, which starts here and ends here. It's less than 2 pages. These are all of the principal powers of Congress. There's a few other places in the Constitution, but most of it's found right here. And a lot of this stuff is really narrow, like the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and foreign coin, and fix the standards of weights and measures, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting, to establish post offices and post roads. These are pretty narrow powers, right? So the Founding Fathers think of the states, the 13 states, as individual independent countries. They were coming together and they were agreeing that we will give some of our power to the federal government, and we're going to give them a very short list. This is a very small government. Now, get this though. The Founding Fathers had to, so they met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. So Philadelphia is a very hot place. If you think Kansas in August is humid, it is, as you know, but Philadelphia is so much worse. I spent a summer in Philadelphia one year, way back when I was rowing. Back to sports, I was rowing competitively, and I was going to try to make the U.S. national team. And I rented an apartment in Philadelphia, and I spent one night in that apartment. It didn't have air conditioning. I couldn't sleep, and so the next day I went and bought a giant air conditioner, shoved it in the window, and just slept right underneath the air conditioner. But it is a muggy, nasty place. Why am I telling you this? Because when the Founding Fathers met in the summer of 1787 to draft the Constitution, they met in the Philadelphia State House, which we now call Independence Hall, and they closed the windows. They met for an entire summer with closed windows. There was no breeze. Why in the world did they do that? And they were wearing wigs, too, by the way. So why did they do that? Because they didn't want the public to hear the deliberations until they had a final product ready to show the public, because they were worried they were going to have a hard time selling this to the public. They were worried that this little tiny list was going to be too much. And that's exactly what the reaction was. The Anti-Federalists, which were the people opposed to this Constitution, they said, this is too much power, too much power. And so the Federalists started defending the Constitution. Have you heard of the Federalist Papers? Yes. That's Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay started writing op-eds in all of the major papers of the country. And the Federalist Papers is just a collection of their op-eds, right? And one of the most important ones was Federalist 45. This is James Madison in January of 1788. He's trying to persuade the American people that no, this is not a big list. This is a small list. Here's what he says. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former, the federal government, will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all of the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. Does that sound like what we have today? No, of course not. Now it's the federal government that controls all of the things that concern our ordinary lives. The feds decide what the composition of the gasoline in our vehicles is. The feds decide whether our cars have a catalytic converter or not. The feds decide whether the food we eat is approved or not. What drugs we can take. So if James Madison, and I hope not the masks yet. If James Madison were to go forward in a time machine and come to Seneca in 1920, go to 1920, 100 years ago, he would recognize this system as the same system he designed in the Constitution. But if James Madison would then get back in his time machine and go to 2020 and stand here in this room with us, and we described what the government is like, he would say, that is not what I wrote. So something happened. The founding document it no longer reflects the kind of government we have. Okay, one last point on fundamental principles. And I'm right on schedule. Okay, the last point is this. What does the Constitution do? Does the Constitution restrict what I can do to you and you can do to me? No, the Constitution doesn't affect individuals. It doesn't restrict individuals. That's what garden variety state laws do. That's what the state legislature does, is they write laws concerning private property, concerning trespassing, concerning crimes. That's a state law, or even a local law could do that. Does the Constitution give power to the states? No, the states already had the power. The states were giving power to the federal government. What the Constitution does is it gives a little bit of power to the federal government. It defines, when elections should occur and things like that. But then it puts a big box around the government. It says, here are lots of things the federal government cannot do. Here are the only things that they can do. And there's, in addition, the Bill of Rights, which says that even if the federal government is operating in an area where it is allowed to operate, you cannot violate these rights. Think of it this way. The Constitution is a cage. It is a carefully constructed cage. And inside the cage, what do we put? The government. The government is the beast. The government is the Leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes would have described it. You have to confine the beast. You have to keep it from growing too big. Okay, so let's see if the Founding Fathers were successful in building that cage. All right, so part two, the commerce power. Now, why is he talking about the commerce power? That doesn't sound very interesting. Well, it might not seem interesting, but it actually has become the mother of all congressional powers. All right? So the commerce power is found in Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the power to regulate Congress with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. To regulate commerce among the several states. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the Founding Fathers would have said it's very simple, and the early Supreme Court opinions tell us what it is. It's the power to regulate the channels and instrumentalities of commerce. Channels are the navigable waterways and the coast of the United States. And then the instrumentalities are ships. So one of the first things the first Congress did in 1789 was issue coasting licenses. These are licenses to operate a ship up and down the Atlantic coast of the United States. They also regulated piloting licenses, the ability to pilot a riverboat up and down the riverways of the United States. That's what the power to regulate interstate commerce was. And then a few decades later, with the arrival of the trains, the channels of commerce included railroad tracks that crossed a state line. If the railroad stayed within a state, Congress couldn't regulate it. And the trains on those tracks. So that's all it was. Okay, so that's not a big deal. How did that become a problem? Okay, fast forward to the Great Depression and the stock market crash. In 1932, Roosevelt wins a landslide election, and so do a bunch of members of Congress and the Senate. In fact, that was the last time Kansas ever elected a Republican senator, was 1932, in the landslide election of 1932. And that's also when Landon...
Democrat.
Did I say Democrat? Okay, sorry. Last time we elected a Democrat, sorry, was 1932. And also that's when Alf Landon lost the election to Roosevelt, too. So it was a landslide election. And when Roosevelt came in, he then started passing, with his huge majority, supermajority in Congress, they started passing a series of laws that were new agencies. The federal government was now going to regulate a whole bunch of things they'd never touched before. They were going to regulate prices, wages, products, hours in the workplace, food, agriculture, crops and quotas. And suddenly you had this alphabet soup of new agencies. The National Labor Relations Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. And the Supreme Court of the United States, starting in 1933, struck those things down. They said, there's nothing in this Constitution that allows you to do this. There's nothing in here that allows you to regulate prices. You can't do that. And the Roosevelt administration said, well, maybe the commerce power. Maybe we can justify this under the commerce power. The Supreme Court said no, 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 and no. And they kept striking these down by 5-4 and 6-3 decisions. The four most conservative justices gained the nicknames the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse because they were so critical of the Roosevelt administration. Okay, fast forward. 1937, in March, Roosevelt does one of his fireside chats on the radio, and he's getting pretty fed up with the Supreme Court. And he says, this, I'm paraphrasing, he says, the Supreme Court of the United States is not acquainted with the conditions of the Dust Bowl of the Midwest. They are not acquainted with the conditions of unemployment across the East Coast. They do not know what this country is going through, so we are going to have to change something. Either we're going to have to amend the Constitution, and that would take too long, and it would take 3/4 of the states, and we probably couldn't get 3/4 of the states. So we're going to change the Supreme Court. And he offered the plan known as the court packing plan in 1937. And it was introduced into Congress. The proposal was to add 6 new justices. So the 6-3 majority against Roosevelt would turn into a 9-6 majority in favor of Roosevelt. And it started its way into the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then 2 of the justices caved. They got scared, and they changed their position, and that was called the switch in time that saved 9. A play on the words of the stitch in time saves 9. And so they switched and then decided they would vote in favor of Roosevelt's programs. And that happened in 1937 in the case of NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. I won't go into the details of the decision, but they basically said, okay, with the commerce power, you can regulate the channels and instrumentalities of commerce, but you can also regulate things that substantially affect interstate commerce. What does that mean? Anything they want, exactly. And so fast forward now, 1942, the case is Wickard versus Filburn. And in Wickard v. Filburn, it was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the Agricultural Adjustment Act set quotas on how much you could grow on your farm of certain commodities. This farmer, Filburn, he's got a quota on how much wheat he can grow. And he says, fine, I will only grow as many acres as my quota allows. However, I'm going to grow a couple of extra acres over here, and those are for our own private consumption. We will not put them on the market. We will grind the wheat into flour. We will consume it in our own household. We will not sell it to anybody, just like the eggs from our chicken coop. We can do that, can't we? And just like the garden behind the house, we're growing fruit there. That's okay, isn't it? So why can't we grow a little bit of extra wheat? Well, the Roosevelt administration says, oh, no, you don't. You can only grow as many acres of wheat as the federal government allows you to grow, and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And Roosevelt's Justice Department argues against Filburn and says, you know what? Farmer Filburn, if he does this, he might grow a few extra acres of wheat, but he's not purchasing that on the marketplace. And what if 10,000 farmers just like Filburn do that? Well, now you've got 20,000 extra acres of wheat growing, and that wheat is not being put into the market. It's going to affect the price of wheat because they would otherwise be purchasing it on the market. And so that causes a tiny incremental change in the price of wheat. Therefore, you are substantially affecting interstate commerce. Therefore, the federal government can regulate you. Yes. So just think about that. You can multiply anything you want times 10,000 to produce an effect on the market. So here's my iced tea. Now, is this my iced tea?
Yeah,
that's mine. I don't know whose it is. Okay, it's mine. All right, I'm going to take a sip. So I could put some Sweet and Low in this iced tea. Now let's say that that Sweet and Low had a slightly higher amount of saccharin or a slightly lower amount of saccharin, making it slightly better tasting. Well, if you did, and it made me want to buy it. If it made one person want to buy it, then it could make 10,000 other people want to buy it. And therefore, the federal government can regulate how much saccharin to put in that Sweet and Low. You pick any product, a ballpoint pen. Got one of those? If there's a certain amount of ink in that ballpoint pen, and the federal government says, if we reduce the amount of ink in ballpoint pens, that'll increase the total number of pens sold if you multiply it times tens of thousands. So we're going to regulate the amount of ink in that ballpoint pen. You can pick anything and imagine how if you multiply it 10 times thousands, you will produce an effect on interstate commerce, and fewer ballpoint pens will move across state lines. Okay, so that happened in 1937. From 1935 to 1995, the Supreme Court did not strike down a single act of Congress as going too far under the commerce power. And it was during that period, those 60 years, the feds began regulating our food, our drugs, our cars, our anything affecting in any significant way, and our gasoline, our fuel, our guns, all of that stuff. And then they started creating federal crimes when previously there were no federal crimes in that area, and it was all under the guise of the commerce power. Okay, but then something happened in 1995. For the first time in 60 years, the Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress as going too far under the commerce power. And I was in my final year of law school at Yale Law School. And the professors at Yale were all long in the face. They were, oh no, the Supreme Court has struck down an act of Congress. And meanwhile, those of us in the Federalist Society were, oh yes, the Supreme Court finally struck down an act of Congress. The case was United States versus Lopez. Remember the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1991? That's the act that says you can't take a gun within a certain number of feet of a school. That was passed by the Congress. I think it was split Congress. Republicans may have controlled the Senate, and the Democrats controlled the House. And signed by George H.W. Bush. Anyway, so this act said you can't bring a gun with a certain number of feet of school. This case comes out of Texas. This kid Lopez takes a gun to his high school. He's not trying to shoot anybody. He doesn't want to do anything with the gun. He just wants to show his friends the gun. He keeps it in his locker. But word spreads around the high school that Lopez has got a gun. And so the teachers find out about it, and the law enforcement is called, and they throw the book at him, and they prosecute him under the Gun-Free Schools Act. Again, he didn't try to hurt anybody. He just brought a gun to the school to show his friends. Okay, so the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Clinton Justice Department, this is 1995, defends the case and defends the law. And Lopez's attorney says, Congress doesn't have the authority to do this. He wasn't going to sell the gun. There's no interstate commerce. He didn't take it across a state line when he went to the school. How can there be interstate? How does it even affect interstate commerce if Lopez takes the gun to the school and then brings it back? That doesn't affect commerce in any way. And the Justice Department of Bill Clinton, Janet Reno, says this argument. They said, well, wait a minute. If he brings that gun to school that day, the other kids in math class are going to know there was a gun in his locker, and they are going to be afraid. And they are not going to be able to concentrate on math for that day. And if they can't concentrate on math that one day, then at the end of the year when they take their final exam in math, they're going to be just a little bit less smart in math. And then when they graduate and get a job, they're going to be a little bit less productive because they didn't pay attention that one day in math. And if you multiply that times 10,000 kids, there will be an effect on our economy because Texans will be less productive. And that laugh is exactly what the Supreme Court did. Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a wonderful opinion saying, we will not heap inference upon inference upon inference to find some effect on commerce. We are drawing a line, and we are saying that Congress does not have this power. And that's why it was such a breath of fresh air. And Justice Thomas, who has always been one of the best purists on the court, he said, you know what? I'd strike down all the decisions going back to 1937. Anyway, he didn't control a majority, but the majority was the 5 justices were at least willing to go with Chief Justice Rehnquist and say, you know what, this goes too far. And so finally the Supreme Court started coming back toward the original meaning of the commerce power. And there were a couple of other decisions that said to Congress, no, no. And so Congress is finally being told there are limits. And that's good, because if there are no limits to the commerce power, what happened to the doctrine of enumerated powers? If one of these enumerated powers is so big that it includes everything, then it's no longer a government of limited powers. It's a government can do whatever it wants. It just calls it a regulation on commerce. So anyway, now fast forward to 2013. NFIB versus Sebelius. That's the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus our own beloved Kathleen Sebelius, who was Obama's HHS secretary. No, yeah. And she, this was Obamacare. And in that opinion, the question was, does Obamacare violate the commerce power? Does it go beyond the commerce power? And that with respect to requiring the individual mandate, requiring individuals to purchase health insurance. The people challenging it at the NFIB said, there's no interstate commerce here. You're regulating people who choose not to be in commerce. They don't want to purchase insurance. The federal government can't tell those people to go purchase insurance and say they're regulating commerce. No, they're regulating people outside of commerce. And to his credit, Chief Justice Roberts writes an opinion that is very good in the first half and says Congress does not have this power under the commerce power. Now, if he'd stopped the opinion right there, we would have all been applauding Chief Justice Roberts and said, nice job, attaboy, pat on the back. But then he went on to write the second half of the opinion. And in the second half of the opinion, he and the liberal justices came up with an excuse that wasn't even mentioned before Congress. And that is, well, if this isn't a commerce power law, maybe it's part of the taxing power. Now, the power to tax says this. It's also in Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. The tax doesn't have any restriction on what you can tax, but it is for paying debts, right? And providing for the welfare. So one of the problems with that argument is this tax was never intended to be collected, right? The idea with the tax was it's a $700 penalty on anyone who doesn't purchase insurance. They didn't want to raise money with it. So it was kind of a weak argument, but nevertheless, Roberts and the 4 liberal activist justices bought the argument and said, okay, it's a tax. Therefore, Congress can pass Obamacare. All right. And that's why we still had Obamacare and still have Obamacare. Now let's fast forward again to this year, 2020. Did you know that there is a case in the Supreme Court right now on the legality of Obamacare? And the challenge to Obamacare this time is the fact that in 2017, the Trump tax cut, a few clever Republicans, when they were cutting all the big taxes, also included in that bill eliminating the Obamacare tax penalty. Okay, so that tax penalty is gone. Now Obamacare is not a tax. So the one leg that Obamacare was standing on just got sawed off. And so the question, and the case won't be decided before the election. The case will probably be decided in December, maybe January, February. And the question is Obamacare dead? And it's almost, well, is the individual mandate dead? The answer will be almost certainly yes. And then the second question in the case is the rest of Obamacare dead, or is that severable? And the rest of Obamacare is still alive? And that'll be an interesting split to see what the court says. But the point is that the commerce power is not sufficient to sustain Obamacare. So let's quickly summarize the history. I'm right on schedule here. Okay, we're half hour in. Let's quickly summarize the schedule, what happened here. So we started with the Founding Fathers. Things got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse to the Wickard versus Filburn and the 20th century. And then finally in 1995, the court started coming back with conservative justices appointed by Republican presidents, and we're starting to move back. We're still a long way from here, but we're moving in the right direction. What happens in this election in 97 days, 98 days, will determine whether we continue coming back to the Founding Fathers' Constitution or whether we turn and go the other way. Because these commerce power decisions, 5-4 decisions, almost every one of them. So if a President Biden, oh man, that sounds bad just to say that, doesn't it? I'm going to say it one more time, just so we understand how bad it is. Yeah, fingers on the crossboard, fingernails on the chalkboard. If President Biden appoints a liberal justice when there is a vacancy, that's potentially going to just open the door again, and Congress can do whatever they want under the commerce power. If a President Trump is reelected and is allowed to replace any justices on the court, he may be able to increase the 5-4 majority to a 6-3 majority and continue to keep Congress in the cage that the Founding Fathers designed. Okay, topic number 3 is the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause is part of the First Amendment. Yeah, quick question.
Senator Kobach, I have
Almost, we hope.
I've always wondered, when the Marxists closed the interstates, which is interstate commerce, is that a felony?
Oh yeah, when the Antifa rioters close it, yeah, it can be depending potentially if because it is federal property if it's an interstate. Although, did they close an interstate or was it a state highway?
Interstates, lots of times.
Yeah, the interstates are governed by a whole bunch of federal rules. I cannot recall. I'd have to go look at the federal statutes to see if there is a federal law prohibiting obstruction of an interstate. It might only be a state law, but if there's a federal law, then absolutely it's a federal felony.
I'm sure it's a federal law.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the individual mandate, when that was struck down, what about the poor people that got hit $600-700 on their taxes?
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
that going to be refunded? Or is it
Probably no, because when the Supreme Court strikes down a law, which they probably will do later this year or early next year, they don't usually look back in time and say everybody who was wrongly prosecuted under this law is hereby refunded. However, that doesn't mean that a person couldn't seek a refund and get it. It just doesn't mean that it means the Supreme Court's opinion won't automatically give it to you. A person might be able to sue after that and get it back. Okay, I want to keep going to the Establishment Clause, and then we'll take a bunch of questions afterward. The Establishment Clause, found in the First Amendment. The Establishment Clause says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? Respecting an establishment of religion. We don't usually use those words today, but it means this. Congress shall make no law creating an official religion of the United States. Why did they put that in there? Because in 1553, Mary Queen of Scots established the Catholic Church as the official religion of the United Kingdom. And that sat well with about half the population, but didn't sit well with the other half the population. And then a few years later, Mary's sister Elizabeth took power, and Mary Queen of Scots came to an unfortunate end. And Queen Elizabeth set in motion the establishment of the Anglican Church of King Henry VIII as the Protestant official religion of the United Kingdom. And for the next 50 years, there were coup attempts, insurrections, murder, and intense unrest in England over the question of who the monarch would be and whether the official religion of England would be Catholic or Protestant. To the Founding Fathers, this was recent history. And they said, you know what? We're not going to have that fight. In America, there will be no official religion of the United States. That's all it meant. If you look at what some of the other Founding Fathers wrote about it, George Mason, so James Madison drafted the wording of the First Amendment. James Madison always wrote in very tight, spare phrases. He did not use a lot of words. Sometimes that's nice for writing, but sometimes it leaves a lot open to the imagination, right? Now, George Mason had an alternative phrasing for the First Amendment, and First Amendment establishment and free exercise clauses together. And his phrasing was not chosen, but the consensus is that he was essentially trying to express the same thing that James Madison did with fewer words. Here's what George Mason proposed phrasing it as. He said, all men have an equal, natural, and unalienable right to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, and that no particular sect or society of Christians ought to be favored or established by law in preference to others. Interesting. He's basically saying, yeah, we're not going to establish one as the official one, but he's actually got an assumption in there that it would be Christians, presumably, if one were established, but we can't establish one. Okay, so That's all that the Establishment Clause meant, no official religion. But then in the 1950s and 60s, the ACLU decided we're going to use the Establishment Clause to change change America and change American schools especially. And they said, what if establishment means more than just an official religion? What if establishment means doing anything to help or advance or promote or endorse or encourage religion? Then we could make this little clause do a whole lot of work for us, the ACLU said. And they successfully pressed the Warren Court, which included Justice Brennan, the Warren Court of the 1950s and 60s to make a whole bunch of changes. The only Kansan ever to serve as president, Dwight Eisenhower, was asked after he was president, he said, did you make any mistakes? And he said, yes, I made 2 of them. They're both sitting on the Supreme Court. And he was referring to Chief Justice Warren. And this is exactly what happened. 1962, the court eliminates prayer in public school. That's the Engel decision. 1963, the court rules that Bible reading in public school is unconstitutional. That's the Schempp decision. 1980, the court rules that you cannot post the 10 Commandments in a public school. That's Graham. In 1985, the court says you can't even have a moment of silence in a public school. That's Wallace versus Jaffrey. Seems like the schools could use a few more moments of public silence, couldn't they? And then in 1992, the court bars prayer at a graduation ceremony. That's Lee versus Weissman. 2000, the court rules in a case coming out of Texas that you can't have a student-led prayer written by the students over the loudspeaker before a football game. That's kind of weird because I think in Texas, football is actually a form of religion, isn't it? But I don't know. Okay, so then in 2005, there was a perplexing pair of cases. In 2005, the Supreme Court rules that in a Kentucky courthouse case, you cannot post the 10 Commandments on the wall of a Kentucky courthouse. But on the same day, the Supreme Court rules, you can put the 10 Commandments on a monument on the Texas State House grounds. How can the 10 Commandments be okay here and not okay here? Both government property. And the answer is 2 words, Justice Breyer. It was a 5-4 decision in both cases, and Justice Breyer was in the majority of both cases. He switched. And Justice Breyer said it's all a matter of context. One, the courthouse looks to be more of an endorsement of religion. The State House grounds, there's other statues around. It doesn't seem as prominent. It doesn't really endorse religion there. And, of course, that means that our Establishment Clause amounts to whatever Justice Breyer had for breakfast that morning, right? What kind of constitution is one that's based all on context? Anyway, but at least it was a slight improvement. At least in one instance, the 10 Commandments was allowed. Now fast forward to 2019. How many of you heard of the Bladensburg Cross case? Anyone hear of it? Okay. This was a case concerning the Bladensburg Cross, which was a 32-foot high cross built in 1925 along a Maryland highway just north of D.C. to commemorate the war dead of the First World War. It was built by the American Legion with private money on private ground next to the state highway. Well, over time, the highway grew bigger, and the state used eminent domain to take that private ground, and they built another lane on the other lanes on the other side. So now the cross is in the middle of the highway on public ground. The American Humanist Association, which is an atheist group, says you can't do that. You can't have a cross next to a highway. Look at all those people seeing that cross. My goodness, they might be encouraged to have favorable thoughts about religion if they have to go through that to see that cross. And so the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the atheist group says you've got to tear down that cross, or you've got to break off the horizontal arms of the cross and make it look like the Washington Monument. Can you believe it? So they're demanding the cross be torn down. And the Supreme Court deliberates on the case, and in 2019, thank God, the court decides that the cross can stand. And Justice Alito wrote an opinion for the court, for the majority, and Justice Alito wrote this. He said, "A government that roams the land, tearing down monuments with religious symbolism and scrubbing away any reference to the divine, will strike many as aggressively hostile to religion." Amen. Right? Well, his words were right on the money, because a following case was coming out of the 11th Circuit, which includes Florida. There was a similar cross called the Bayview Cross in Pensacola, Florida, that overlooked the bay. And a similar group, I can't remember if it was the Atheists or the ACLU, I get them confused. They brought a case against the Bayview Cross, and they were trying to tear that cross down. And the 11th Circuit said, well, whatever the Supreme Court does with the Bladensburg Cross, we will do with the Bayview Cross. So because the Bladensburg Cross stands, so the Bayview Cross stands. And if the Bladensburg case had gone the other way, there indeed would have been crosses torn down all across America. Now, what was the decision in the Bladensburg case? It was a 7-2 decision. Well, does that mean we should rest easy? No. Because 2 of the justices in the 7-justice majority were Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. If Hillary Clinton had won the 2016 election, it would be Justice Garland and whoever else Hillary would have put forward. And the 7-2 decision would have been a 5-4 decision. But we're still okay, right? No. Because one of those 5 justices was Justice Breyer. And if he was the swing justice again, 4-4 with him making the decision, I sure hope he would eat the right thing for breakfast that morning. Because something tells me that under those circumstances, he might have seen the context a little bit differently and gone with the other side. So we came this close to having crosses being torn down across the United States. Which brings us to, the conclusion. These cases are 5-4 cases in many instances. And whatever happens in the 2020 election will affect whether or not expressions of religion in the public square are allowed, or crosses that were built on private property and are now on public property are allowed or not allowed. So the election of the president will determine that, and the election of the senators will determine that, because the senators are the final barrier between putting someone on the court for life and not putting them on the court for life, which is one of the reasons why I feel like I have some value as a former constitutional law professor to be a senator. But let's get back to the topic. So again, the Establishment Clause meant this at the beginning, but after the Warren Court years, all of a sudden it means this. And then we finally see the court in 2005 starting to come back, toward we're still a long way from this meeting, but at least it's coming back in the right direction. Whatever happens in this election will determine which way the court goes. Okay, part 4, and then I'll take your questions and we'll be done. If you want to leave here, you can just take off. All right, the Second Amendment. Now, the Second Amendment is one of my favorite parts of the Constitution because I not only get to preach about the Second Amendment, I get to practice the Second Amendment. And I hope many of you practice the Second Amendment as well. The other reason I like the Second Amendment, there are a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the other reasons I like it is that Kansas is the #1 state in America in supporting the right to keep and bear arms. How can I brag about our state that way? I don't know. Wait, I'm going to prove it. Wait, you can't clap yet because I haven't proven it to you. Now, I'm going to prove to you that we are the #1 state in America in supporting the right to keep and bear arms. Did you know that every state except Delaware has, whenever there's a constitutional amendment, it's put to a popular vote? So most states have a right to keep and bear arms in their state constitution, and it was put to a popular vote. So we know what percentage of the people of that state support that amendment. Well, Kansas, our state constitution right to keep and bear arms was on the ballot in 2010. And I'm guessing that everybody here who was a voter in Kansas in 2010 remembers voting for this, I hope. And I'm going to read to you what was in the Kansas Constitution. A person has the right to keep and bear arms for the defense of self, family, home, and state, for lawful hunting and recreational use, and for any other lawful purpose. A record 88.2% voted yes. 88.2% of Kansans voting in that election said, yes, we want that in our Constitution. That's the highest of any state in American history. Second place goes to West Virginia in 1986. They had 83.6%. That's pretty good. That's not 88.2. So nice try, West Virginia. Kansas is #1 in the right to keep and bear arms. Okay, now you can clap. And by the way, just to give you a sense of perspective on this, I've studied referendums and polling for a long time in my career. Very rarely will you ever get a vote of the public over 85% on anything. That is the stratosphere. If we put a ballot issue on the election on next Tuesday, and the ballot issue was puppies are cute, there would be fewer than 85% voting yes. I'm not kidding you. You can take the most obvious thing and put it on the ballot, you will rarely get above 85%. There are always at least 15 or 20% of the people who will say, nah, I don't think so. And you could put babies are cute. I don't think that would get above 85%. But so when you have 88% saying this is really important to us, that is extraordinary. That is rarely achieved in any poll, any referendum, anything. So, yay Kansas. And I like it when one of our teams wins the NCAA basketball or football. Well, football's been a long time. Basketball. But you know what? I like it even more when we're number one in the right to keep and bear arms. Okay, Second Amendment. Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? Where did they get those words? Well, they took those words from several states when they ratified the Constitution. They put forward proposals for things that they wanted in the Bill of Rights. And James Madison took those various proposals and combined the wording, and there was similar wording in state constitutions, and he came up with those words. Now, the Supreme Court did not have occasion to rule on what the Second Amendment means all the way until 1939. There was one case in the 1800s that kind of obliquely talked about it, but didn't squarely address what do those words mean. Why did they not have occasion? Because there weren't any regulations on our guns. The federal government wasn't regulating guns until the 20th century. The state governments weren't regulating guns. There were some laws here and there, like forbidding actually the concealed carry of weapons, believe it or not, because concealing weapons was thought to be dishonorable. Carrying your weapon openly was thought to be the right way a gentleman would carry a weapon. Anyway, there were some laws like that, but by and large, there were very few laws regulating the ownership or possession of guns. But then, after the switch in time in 1937, the federal government starts regulating guns. And one of the cases that would get, there were some before then too, but let's get to the point. 1939, there was a federal law that said you could not transport certain weapons across the state line without a federal stamp or a permit. And these two guys, including Mr. Miller, take a sawed-off shotgun and transport it across the Oklahoma-Arkansas state line. And they get caught, and they are prosecuted because they don't have the federal stamp that allows them to do this. And the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Their lawyer says, Second Amendment, of course we have the right to transport our firearms. That's part of keeping and bearing arms. Well, the case goes to the Supreme Court. Remember, this is a very liberal Supreme Court, and by this time, not only was the switch in time, but Roosevelt had a chance to appoint one or two justices. The Supreme Court says, no, Second Amendment doesn't apply because a sawed-off shotgun is not the type of weapon that the Second Amendment covers. How did they come to that conclusion? They said, well, if you look at the words at the beginning, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, we think that the equivalent of the militia today would be the National Guard. And we don't think the National Guard would ever use weapons like a sawed-off shotgun. Well, that's wrong on multiple levels, and of course the military today does use sawed-off shotguns in close combat in the Middle East and other places, but never mind. They said the Second Amendment only applies to weapons that the military would use. So that means it does not apply to a .22 caliber rifle, but it does apply to a flamethrower. I don't know. Okay, so that opinion was issued, and a lot of people, including me, many decades later, were scratching our heads saying, what in the world does this mean? And so this Miller opinion just hung out there, but a lot of liberal attorneys and judges started thinking, oh, the Second Amendment isn't like other amendments that you and I can hold individually. The Second Amendment is only held by a group of people in the National Guard, and they can only hold that right when they're wearing the National Guard uniform. It was called the collective rights theory, and this was being taught in law schools all across the country. Yeah, the Second Amendment's not really what you think it is. It's just for the National Guard. Okay, fast forward to 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller. And this was the first time in our lifetimes, or in the modern times, that the Supreme Court would rule on it again. And this case involved Mr. Heller, and it was a challenge to the District of Columbia, the D.C. gun control laws. And D.C. had very strict gun control laws. The laws limited who could own a handgun or a long gun. Very few people got a permit, and if you had a permit, you still had to keep the gun disassembled, locked and unloaded in your home. Just think about how effective that is. You hear a crash in the middle of the night. The window is broken, and you're saying, excuse me, sir, could you please stay right there? I have to assemble my firearm and find the unlock, the key. So it was made the gun useless for protecting your home in most circumstances. But of course, the District of Columbia did that because that's why they are the safest city in America against crime, right? That was their argument. If we restrict the use and possession of handguns and long guns, then we will make our city safe. Well, that was a joke. Of course, it has one of the highest crime rates of any city. So Heller, his job is as a federal employee. He is a guard at a federal building who carries a sidearm as part of his job. And he says, I want to carry my sidearm home. I don't want to leave it in a locker at the workplace or use a privately owned firearm, whatever. I want to be able to defend myself at home with a firearm. I'm defending that federal building with a firearm. Case goes to the Supreme Court. And by a 5-4 decision, again, thank God, the Supreme Court rules that there is, in fact, an individual right to keep and bear arms. Now, get this, though. The Supreme Court rules that, and let me back up. The decision was written by Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia was, in my opinion, the greatest justice probably ever to be on the Supreme Court, certainly the greatest justice in our lifetimes. And if you've never read a Supreme Court opinion, read District of Columbia versus Heller. Most Supreme Court opinions will put you to sleep. This one won't, especially if you're a fan of the Second Amendment. And Scalia explains in Antonin Scalia fashion how we are to interpret the Constitution. And the only coherent way to interpret the Constitution is to ask, what did those words mean to the people who wrote them? You don't ask, what can those words mean to a liberal professor in 2020 if he wants to change their meaning? No, you ask, what did we the people mean when we the people wrote and ratified those words? And so Scalia says this, there are two words we have to focus on. Militia and regulated. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, militia. He looks at the writings of the time in 1789 and he says, it's clear that militia means this. All of the free people called to arms. The body of free people called to arms is the militia. In other words, everybody in this room is a member of the militia. We are all members of the Kansas militia. That's what the Second Amendment means. The body of people called to arms by the governor in case of an invasion, insurrection, whatever the reason is. Okay, what about the word regulated? When we think of the word regulated with our 2020 context, we think of regulations. So we think something that's regulated is governed by lots of rules. In 1789, there was that definition of regulated, but there was a second definition of regulated. And that's the definition you may have heard when you hear the phrase, the irregulars of the Swamp Fox Francis Marion went up against the regulars of Great Britain in the South. The regular troops and the irregular troops. The regular troops were trained professional troops. Trained is the key. Irregulars were untrained troops. Farmers who grabbed their muskets and went to battle. So to regulate means to train in 1789 speak. Okay, now let's take those definitions and insert them into the words of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. A well-trained body of free people called to arms being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now it makes perfect sense. How are we going to be well-trained unless we have arms to practice with, to train with? And how are we going to be called to arms unless we have arms to bring with us to the battlefield? It wasn't like the federal government had large wagons of arms that they would show up for the farmers to grab their arms. No, you were to bring your own weapon to the battlefield with you. It makes perfect sense. And Scalia explains it better than I just did. But he says this is what it meant. And so therefore, the Second Amendment obviously protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And so thank goodness he wrote this wonderful opinion. And it is a good one to read. Although if you really like reading Scalia, read his dissents. They're even better because he just completely tears apart the logic of the left and of the activist judges. One final thought though on the Second Amendment. The D.C. versus Heller opinion was a 5-4 opinion. There are 4 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court who think we do not have a right to, as individuals, to bear arms. So when you say your prayers at night, I encourage you to pray every once in a while for the 5 justices who believe that we have a right to keep and bear arms. Because if one of them gets hit by a bus tomorrow, the Democrats, who knows whether they'd be able to replace him or him soon enough. And if that person is replaced by a Biden justice, that's going to change it from 5-4 in favor of the Second Amendment to 5-4 against the Second Amendment. And it'll happen like that. So our Second Amendment rights are one heartbeat away from being taken away from us. So that's why, once again, the 2020 election matters. If you care about the Second Amendment, we have to vote for President Trump. If you care about the Second Amendment, we have to vote for senators across this country who also believe in the Second Amendment and will vote for originalist judges and justices. Okay, I want to conclude with a few quotes from somebody else. Okay, this person is one of my favorite people, and I want to see if you can guess who this is. Okay, let's go a little bit further. All right, the laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides, for an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man. Any guesses? Who's that?
Booker Washington.
No. Thomas Jefferson. Yes, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the most outspoken writers of the founding generation about the right to keep and bear arms. And that quote that he just gave, you could have read that quote in the debates of the Kansas legislature about concealed carry, couldn't you? He actually was quoting an 18th century Italian guy, Cesare Beccaria, but whatever, he was saying he agrees with the same thing. But I want to give you two more Jefferson quotes. Okay, this is from a letter to John Cartwright in 1824. The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people and that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed. I'm going to repeat that phrase. It is their right and duty to be at all times armed. So, according to Thomas Jefferson, if you are not armed right now, you are not fulfilling your constitutional duty. Think about that. And Thomas Jefferson is the one member of the Founding Fathers that liberals sometimes will quote. He says we have a duty to be at all times armed. Okay, that's pretty strong brew, isn't it? Okay, now let me give you one more. I love this one. He had this to say about exercise. And this was in a letter to Peter Carr in 1785. A strong body makes the mind strong. As to the species of exercises, I advise the gun. While this gives moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. Games played with the ball and others of that nature are too violent for the body and stamp no character on the mind. Let your gun, therefore, be your constant companion of your walks. Thomas Jefferson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. 7:59. We just made it. Okay. So feel free, if you got to be somewhere, I'll take a few questions for 10 minutes if you have any questions. But yes.
I have one. On the labeling of beef when it's for sale,
Yeah.
you've got Walmart beef that you can't hardly, I mean, personally, I can't eat it because I don't think it's fully vegan. What do you think about regulating that industry on labeling beef as beef and fake meat as fake meat?
Yeah, you probably are aware of there's this movement, especially on the left, to encourage people to stop eating beef and start eating this artificial. What's the word they call it?
Dog food.
Dog food. Yeah. Oh, it's called Beyond Beef. Yeah, doesn't that sound nice? Yeah, that's beyond food as far as I'm concerned. The federal government can't force people to, well, they shouldn't, they could actually, but they shouldn't force beef producers to produce their beef in any way, and they should, and I don't think they should prevent people from marketing this Beyond Beef stuff. I hope people never buy it, but the point is the label should be truthful. The label should give us as much information as possible, and that's the whole principle behind labeling in the first place. If the federal government's going to do this, and of course they're stretching the commerce power, but that's another subject. If they're going to do this, at least label truthfully and tell us not only what's in it, and whether it's truly beef or some percentage beef, but also tell us where it's from. And it's not just about protecting the cattle ranchers in Kansas. It's also about protecting us as consumers. We have every right to know what's in our food. Yeah.
Back to the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
And the Second Amendment. If it would pass in Washington D.C., what could the state of Kansas do to still bear arms? Is there anything we can do?
Oh, if the Supreme Court were to strike down?
Yeah.
Yes. So if the Supreme Court, all would not be lost. So if the Supreme Court said the Second Amendment no longer protects the right to keep and bear arms, there still could be state constitutional protections for the right to bear arms. So say some city, say Seneca would never do this, but say Kansas City, Kansas says you cannot possess a firearm in your home at all, period. Then you would no longer be able to sue under the Second Amendment. You wouldn't be able to defend yourself if prosecuted or sue in a civil case. But you could then resort to the Kansas Constitution to try to protect yourself. So you would still have the Kansas Constitution protecting you, but remember, not every state has wording like the Kansas Constitution or is as strong as the Kansas Constitution. So there would be lots of people around the country who would not be able to protect themselves using a constitutional provision.
So what about this couple that they put in jail because they tried to protect
the in St. Louis, yeah, the couple that stood in front of their home
that was a disgrace.
Yeah, and I don't think they're in jail unless something's happened that I'm not aware of, but they're threat of prosecution. Right. And the prosecutor in St. Louis, she's claiming that she's going to go after them. Fortunately, the governor of St. Louis is saying that he will pardon them if anything does happen. But it's outrageous that they are even under threat of prosecution because they are bearing arms in their home. They're keeping them for the defense of themselves and for the defense of their property. All they did was brandish their arms. Yeah. And so that's part of bearing arms, right? You're bearing them visibly. I think if they were prosecuted, they could definitely bring a Second Amendment defense because they didn't use them aggressively. They didn't use them at all. They simply held them and bore them while they stood in front of their house. So they certainly would have a Second Amendment defense, as well as they would have defenses under the laws of Missouri, which would allow that you are permitted under the laws of Missouri to defend yourself and to defend your home. So just because they're being threatened with prosecution doesn't mean that prosecution would succeed. But that's
just the idea that they're having to go through this.
Well,
right.
It reflects a problem in our society, and that is that the radical left does not just the radical left, the entire Democratic Party today does not believe that we should be allowed to protect our homes and our families with firearms. They just don't think that that's what a civilized a modern government allows.
Then who's supposed to protect us?
Exactly. Who's supposed to protect us? And isn't it funny, or not funny, it's tragic, but isn't it interesting that the very same cities that are saying defund the police are the same cities a couple years ago that were so pro-gun control? They were saying you don't need to own guns because you are amateurs and you might hurt yourself. You need to rely on the professionals to protect you. The police will protect you because they're trained and you're not. Well, now those same cities are saying, we're going to defund the police and get rid of the police. So when you dial 911, there will be a very nice social worker there to console you and tell you don't worry about the loss of your possessions. This is insanity. But the left does not think we should own firearms, does not think we should ever have to use firearms, and now they're trying to take away the men and women in blue who would protect us with their firearms. Yeah.
Martial law, is that federal or is it state?
Well, neither. I mean, neither the federal government nor the state government is authorized to declare martial law. Although, during the Civil War, actually Lincoln did in some areas declare martial law, but in those instances, Lincoln was certainly stretching federal power. There is, however, an act, the Insurrection Act of 1807, that does allow for the use of federal troops to suppress an insurrection. So and that's certainly what President Trump could rely on. When people are talking about does President Trump have the authority to use federal troops or federal law enforcement officials, there's really two clear cases where he does, and there are others, but the two clearest ones are if he's defending federal property. A federal agency may absolutely defend federal property, and that's what was happening in Portland. Contrary to what the Portland mayor said, federal police were not provoking anyone. They were inside the building until the building was attacked, and then they came out and defended it. And then the Insurrection Act allows the president to use federal forces if there is an actual insurrection or a threat to law and order that is, that is not being solved with local or state officials.
Why doesn't Antifa fall under that?
Well, they could be, in the sense that if President Trump wanted to use federal forces to defend against an Antifa riot, he could, because that would constitute an insurrection under the Act of 1807. Yeah.
Is Antifa declared a terrorist organization?
I don't think they have been yet, but they sure they sure seem to meet the definition. Did he declare it? Yeah, I think he tweeted it. I don't think it's been official yet, but no, it's certainly it's interesting. President Trump has tweeted a number of things that are really interesting, and I think potentially absolutely correct. He also tweeted that the Mexican cartels should be declared terrorist organizations because they basically they use the threat of violence to control large swaths of Mexico. They are like warlords within these areas. And he says, therefore, they meet the definition of terrorist organizations. Yeah.
I have a question about the Supreme Court. If hopefully Trump gets in and we get another justice, but they were saying something about the Democrats said, well, if he gets one in, we're going to pass a new law and issue more Supreme Court justices so we can stack it in our favor. Is there any way to stop that?
Well, yeah, the interesting fact about that is that the Constitution does not set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. So Congress has and can determine the number of justices on the court. And it actually has grown over time. And then around the time of the Civil War, it went all the way up to 10. And Congress decided, no, we need an odd number. Let it come back to 9. And it's been 9 ever since. But yeah, just like Roosevelt could have, if he had succeeded in passing it, could have increased the court to 15. So too could Congress today, but the president would have to sign it. So they could, if they had majorities in both houses and they had a Democrat president, they could increase the number of justices to whatever number they want. Yeah.
That tax you talked about on Obama healthcare,
yeah.
Where they got that idea?
Where?
Beef checkoff.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Is a complete copy of
the
whole thing. And what would you do on this? A lot of these packing plants are being owned by foreign countries.
Yeah, there's.
What would be done there to stop this? Because Smithfield, China, JVS.
Yeah,
Isn't
so
there security on this stuff?
There is. This raises a really good point. So I was talking about the 4 big beef packers. They're Brazilian owned. Smithfield, which is one of the biggest pork processing companies, they're now owned by China. And this poses a number of problems. In the beef side, we have the problem of the Brazilian companies bringing in and substituting Brazilian beef for American beef, and we have no idea that it's happening. On the Chinese side, we have our number one adversary in the world controlling a vital part, an important and big part of our food supply in the United States with that major pork processor. And they've already started, they initially said we're only going to take a small percent, I think 10% or something like that, of the pork processed in their facilities and send it to China. But now they're going higher and higher and higher. And they are owning the plant for the benefit of China, not for the benefit of the United States. And so anytime a foreign country, especially an adversary, owns a critical part of our food supply, that should worry us. And I think Congress and the Senate should act to place restrictions on that. Look, when China, this whole coronavirus thing erupted, I found out for the first time, I didn't realize, maybe you knew it, but I didn't realize that 95% of our antibiotics are manufactured in China. 95%. And I didn't realize that 97% of ibuprofen is manufactured in China. I don't know about you, but once I hit the age of 50, I like my vitamin I. After I have a hard day outside,
I need that vitamin I. Anyway, this is a problem. What if we found out that 97% of our ammunition was manufactured in China? Do you think we would stand for it for a moment? No, it would be a national crisis, and we would be moving heaven and earth to try to bring our manufacturing of ammunition back into the United States, right? Well, antibiotics are just about as important as ammunition, I would say. Maybe more. I don't know. Probably not more. But they're as important because they're critical to the health of the United States. And so we have to, in the Senate, and this is going to be a very high priority of mine, we have to take extraordinary measures to bring production back into the United States. And if we can't bring those companies back, then we have to encourage American companies here to develop that production. We cannot be in a situation where our number one adversary in the world is producing things that are so vital to us and to our national security. That is a big problem. And we have to also have a mindset recognizing what China is. China is a country that if they teach their kids in school that the United States, it's not like an Islamist instruction where they teach them that the United States is the great Satan. They see China as the hegemon that controls the world, and that it is the barrier to China, which is the true power that should ultimately control the world. It's the central kingdom. This goes back thousands of years in Chinese history, and they still teach it. We are the barrier to them achieving their national dream, which is controlling the world, controlling its trade, controlling its wealth, controlling its culture. And so we have to understand that China comes to the bargaining table with a whole different set of ideas. It's not like the elder George Bush thought in the 1990s that, well, China, now that the Cold War is over, China's going to become like us. They're going to become richer, and they're going to become more free, and their government will become more like our government, and everything will be apple pie and honey and rainbows. No, China is our adversary, and they are out to dominate us in every sphere they can. And so we have to be very serious about whenever they control part of our food supply or our medical supply or anything. Yeah.
Yes. Jeanette's and my daughter's granddaughter is homeschooled, and she could tell you the Civil War, it was a fight for half of the nation, but she could tell you today it's a fight for all of our nation. And as you talked about the Marxists, they can't get Marxism because it's been a failure. They can't convince people that way. But as you talked about property and our families,
yep,
and our religion, destroying that. I read a few years ago about in China when they started knocking all the crosses down. I never thought that would happen in our country. It's been happening. Christopher Columbus with large crosses and boarding up crosses in New Mexico so you can't see them.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, you might say, why are they using Black Lives Matter? It's because it's a race thing. If you're against that, well, so they're using race to promote the Marxism in this country. And what you said about the governors calling up the militias, but in this country today, there's too many Laura Kelly governors.
Yeah.
I guess that's her first name.
Yep.
And I know in our county, townships are very strong. They're controlled by their finances by the state. But I see the only way that you can have a well-regulated militia today would be to have it controlled by the counties. And that's what they're doing in Oregon now. Oregon has 17 counties. They're trying to secede from Oregon and go into Idaho.
I've heard about that.
Pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Because they're done with the crazy city people.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. West Virginia, seceded from Virginia at the time of the Civil War. And so it's times like this when our nation is so divided that you see parts of a state thinking about seceding because they disagree with the rest of that state.
I wish all the cities would secede.
Yeah.
Yesterday or Monday, Trump signed a bill having to do with the pharmaceutical companies and taking out the middleman.
Yes. Yeah. I think it wasn't a bill. I think it was an executive order. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I have, to full disclosure, I haven't had a chance to read it yet because I've been on the road for the past 3 days, but I intend to, because one of the things that is affected is insulin. And both Molly and I, as she mentioned, are type 1 diabetics. But
Okay, so a lot of young people right now are leaning very, very libertarian.
yes.
And part of that is, I wish that my son could have been here tonight to hear you, because we didn't start out with all of these regulations that we have now.
Right.
And so part of what they're saying is we have too many regulations. And their comment on that was that when you take out the middleman, then you make it more expensive. It takes out that balance. I don't know, but I was wondering what you thought about that. I have a couple more. Can you speak to the libertarian issue and the Constitution? And then I want to know if you think eminent domain is constitutional. And then I want to know what you thought about if you've seen the thing with the frontline doctors and they were removed off of Facebook and YouTube and all of that.
Okay. Yeah, those are a lot of big topics. Okay, I'll. We're all here for another half hour, right? All right. Now this will be the last question. I'll just try to address it fairly quickly. So the first part was.
Libertarian.
Oh, libertarian. Oh, yeah. So I agree with the one of the fundamental pillars of libertarian thought, which is that regulation is expensive. Right, and that recognition is why the Prime Act is so helpful to the beef industry, to the cattle producers, and to small and medium-sized packers. If you take the federal regulations away, you're taking away the expense, and so now small and medium-sized packers can get back in business. So I think that premise of libertarianism is exactly right. Regulations are not only in some cases oppressive; they are almost in all cases expensive. Okay, what was the second question? Oh, yeah. Yeah, eminent domain is constitutional. It's actually in the Constitution, but there's a caveat here. So it's in the Constitution. It's described. It was actually assumed to be part of all governments, but in the Fifth Amendment, it's discussed. Okay, where is it? Without due process, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So eminent domain is taking private property for public use. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. As a law professor, I actually, and even as a law student, I wrote a lot about this. So what is the taking of private property for public use? Well, first of all, this gets back to the libertarian point. If you regulate someone's property so much that you've taken away its value, then you've taken away their property. So if you regulate my business by, I don't know, shutting it down for 3 months, that means that you have taken my private property for 3 months, and therefore the government must give compensation. And so that's why I think the federal government had a duty, or the state governments, but the federal government had a duty, if there is a national shutdown, to compensate. Now, one could argue that the state governments are the ones who actually shut it down, and one could quibble about that. But the point is, the private property, the business owners had a right to say, look, you shut my business down, government. Therefore, I am owed compensation, which is why I would have voted for the relief package to give to businesses. But there's another component here. Nor shall it be taken for public use without just compensation. Public use has been litigated, and this is there was an interesting case that went to the Supreme Court more than 10 years ago, and it was what if a city or a county takes your land, and instead of using it to build a public park, they take your land, which has some homes on it, and they give it to a developer who's going to build some fancy, shopping center with hotels and stuff like that. Is that public use? I would say no, but it was the Kelo decision, I believe. I would say no, but the Supreme Court ruled in a narrow decision that it is public use, it's public benefit maybe, to take your property with its homes on it and let them develop some fancy development that's going to bring more taxes, that the public's better off because they get these taxes. I would say no. That's a matter of opinion that the public's better off. You don't think you're better off because you just lost your home and you lost the property around your home. So anyway, I think the Supreme Court got it wrong, and I think the conservative justices and the minority were correct in that opinion. public use has to really mean public use. In other words, it has to be a park or a highway or a government building. If you're going to take that property, it's got to be the public using it, not just giving it to or selling it to some private entity. What's the last question?
And the frontline doctors that were at the Supreme Court, went to the Supreme Court Monday to talk about all the doctors who are saying we have been told how to fill out the coded deaths by the state. We've been hydroxychloroquine does work, but we've been told we can't use it, we can't get it, our pharmacists won't sell it. And these are a bunch of doctors that have gotten together to say it does work, and yes, we're using it, and yes, and they were shut down. They were pulled off of the internet, the Google, YouTube, and they're back again. And a lot of them are being challenged. If they speak up, they're going to lose their license because of the licensing of saying, no, this is how you're going to.
So this is part of the left's attempt to shut down speech that they disagree with. Yes. And this is a big problem, and this is something else I want to address if I'm blessed to get to the Senate, because Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri has been leading the charge, and he needs some backup on this. He's been talking about how, the public square today is in many respects Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat. We don't necessarily go out to the public park and start addressing each other today and talking about politics. We're talking.
Especially now since we're all masked.
Yeah, especially now since we're in. And sometimes they make us stay inside. Right. So the public square today is oftentimes at the keyboard or at your phone, and you're addressing people inside of this forum, this virtual forum, and if the public square does not allow the expression of conservative views, then we might have a problem here. Now, of course, the public square was not created by the government, but the internet was created by the government, and the government has the ability to license what Google may do and what Facebook may do. And so there is a real important role here for the Senate and the House of Representatives and the President to step in if the public square is no longer welcome to those of us who have conservative views. And this has been going on for a long time, or not a long time, but for several years. In 2018, did you know that YouTube banned any video or any content that speaks favorably of an AR-style rifle? In other words, a modern rifle. That's not allowed. Even something that's a training video is not allowed on YouTube anymore because the left has decided that the modern rifle platform is forbidden. They don't even understand it. They don't even know that it's just a basic rifle. It's not something that's just for military use. But the politically correct left is now trying to control what we can say. And it doesn't matter whether it's what these doctors are saying or whether it's talking about firearms or talking conservatively in favor of President Trump. They want to shut down speech. And it is really important that we keep these forums in social media, keep them free. So I'm going to end it there because it is, I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I want to remind you, when you leave, please take a yard sign if you don't have one already. Please take a Trump, those aren't my Trump signs. Is it okay if they take a Trump sign?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I was going to say, anybody that would want to take a Trump or a Kobach sign, please take it. Please talk to your neighbors, your friends, your relatives. Get them to vote. We've got to vote Tuesday. And
contribution forms.
And we have some contribution forms. I also want to acknowledge Randy Garber is here, our state representative. We've got another politician in the making. Dylan Kime is running for county commissioner. I want to thank Kris for coming out tonight. I hope you got something out of this. I know I did. I really think that this is what we need. Is there any comment?
Can we ask Dor